So one of the things we've started to address here has to do with, the power of pre-framing and teaching your players either before you introduce something or right as you introduce it, or introduce elements slowly over time. Uh, and in a lot of ways, in my experience now, I've been doing a lot more of recalibrating and trying new things. Um, Now, with those new things, of course, come new lessons, and also as I've started to mentor a few more people, recognizing as a player in their games, what is it that kind of irks me about something that they're doing, and recognizing, is that me? Am I assuming something, or is it there like a communication issue that I'm having? And I'll usually try and like check myself, not get angry about something, just check myself and write down what it was and think about it later. Um, and this brought up some interesting ideas. And we often use assumptions, or at least in society, we use assumptions kind of in a negative light, that you don't want to assume too much about everything because it gets you in trouble. But I wonder if instead of an assumption, there's a certain expectation, like a generalized rule in your head that you should just uh, put into practice, so that your players have a better time, and that you have a better time, and everybody builds trust and rapport, especially empathy. And I was pondering about these, and I realized that in the beginnings of my DMing experience, did these things. And now I recognize why and like what it came from. It came from experience with Pathfinder. Not to keep throwing Pathfinder under the bus, but Pathfinder has a strong structure of heavy rules, heavy interpretations of those rules, very specific, everything, highly customizable, but so big, so involved. And every single game of Pathfinder I've ever played in has had a discussion of how a certain rule resolves, and play always grinds to a halt. I played Pathfinder for 8 years. Every single session had at least one moment where everything grinds to a halt, and we go, well, it says here in this rule, at this subtext, at this time, that this is how it's done. And we almost have a little mini argument of how the rules are interpreted. That also bred a practice in me and in players that surrounded me to always be ready to defend themselves and justify their rules, justify their play. And it was always a me versus the DM, or the DM versus the players sort of mentality, where you're always trying to find the truth of how this should be interpreted. And it's all justified by the raw. Coming from that to 5th edition, there are these little things at the table that I recognize I used to do and that I've been letting go of. One of these is, and I'm going to say it frame it as an assumption, and I think it's a good thing to assume. The assumption is that information in a campaign can be difficult to remember, especially if you are playing infrequently. Players will probably forget things. They might take excellent notes. You might have a living document that helps them. We might have a lot of different resources, but they can still forget things, or still go, wait, what was the name of that guy again? Because I'll do it too. I'll go, wait, oh no, what was the name of that warlord that we saw 5 months ago? Oh no, well, they're coming back to that city, so I'm sure they're going to see him again. What was his name? Oh man. Player knowledge wanes. And in the beginnings, I would unconsciously punish players for forgetting things. And it never feels good. Like, it's never a good thing. And what it does is it hurts the player and DM relationship. It's like, oh, you should have remembered that. Why? How does that actually help the game state? If you are forced to remember all these other things with all the other things in our lives too. When how cool is it if together we go, oh yeah, about 5 sessions ago, we met this warlord. Remember that guy? He had like the sideburns. He had this weird beard. He talked kind of like this. And they go, oh yeah, that guy. Oh my gosh, is that guy? Yeah, that's that guy. Do you guys remember anything else about him? Oh yeah, didn't this happen? Yeah, that happened. I think this also happened too. Can anyone confirm that for me? And you have this little conversation about like reminding each other what that was. And this assumption that they're probably going to forget things because so are you. How about we help each other remember them? That's an assumption of a collective experience. That also teaches the players that I'm not going to hurt you because you didn't remember a key detail months ago. Why would I do that to you? And unfortunately, in the very beginnings, I was unconsciously doing that. It's a recognition now that, holy moly, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen. And I think it stemmed from that constant need to always be on my game and always have everything, all the answers ready to go at all times. So assume that your players are probably going to forget things and then support them when they do. I'm spiraling into philosophical anger as I stare deeply into the non-existent whiskey glass ahead of me and think deeply about the horrible pasts of my past tables that I've run, the many dungeon masters that I've wanted to punch in the face and defenestrate.
How many lives have I ruined?
How many lives have I ruined from my rules mastering? How dare I, so many times that players have made horrible jokes next to each other, and I've said, you say that in the tavern? You're thrown out of the tavern. How dare you attempt to have humor at the table when you're in character, you silly, silly boy. Make jokes at the table. They're not necessarily in character. Don't punish your players for having fun. Okay.
One of the this really is kind of the theme of this episode, is how to establish trust, right? Because when you establish trust, you can like gift your table with your creative contribution, right? Because really that's what you're doing. You're never interrupting, you're contributing to the story. A lot of times I feel like to go off of what Adam said about your players' intentions and being clear, there's a lot of times in the service of building trust, not every time, but a good amount of the time, my players will want to do something like punch the guard, punch the NPC. And if we're all clear and on the same page, I'm not going to try to one-up them, and that's part of letting my players feel powerful, like they can affect the story. So it's not they go to punch the guard and I'm like, I catch your fist, and then the guard beats you down even though you're a 9th level adventurer because all my guards are 15th level. So it's like it's a lot of times respecting my players' intentions. I mean, I did this with an entire story for Geras. There was an interaction that I talked about on the podcast that I bungled, and I accidentally misrepresented an NPC I made. So when I retold it, I kept the players' actions the same because the player said they were comfortable reacting like that. I made the NPC a lot more insidious because of it. So I took it upon myself as the storyteller and dungeon master. My NPC is secondary to the PCs. So if I need to change my NPC to make the PC's actions make sense and make them come off in a better light, then I'm going to do that. And now my players are going to trust the fact that I'm going to respect their storytelling choices, right? Because a lot of times DMs will be like, well, that's not how this character works, And I'll do that occasionally, especially for Geras right now, we're kind of all coming up on a bunch of really big bad bosses. So for those very keystone anchory characters, maybe they have some unfair powers. But in general, even if it's a pretty high level NPC, I'll just let them get punched, I won't even have an armor class. I'll just be like, oh, you punch them? Okay, they get punched. Don't even roll damage. You punched them. what do you want to do with them next, you know? So that way it's like respecting the character's autonomy and the player's storytelling choices. Another thing Adam mentioned was on memory and just players remembering things. Remember, players will remember it anyway through experience. If they meet the same warlord named Bob enough times, eventually they'll remember the name is Bob. So rather, like you said, Adam, instead of punishing them for whatever reason, even punishment can be something as little as a chastisement, like, wow, you guys didn't remember it. Like, that's a punishment, right? They're embarrassed for not remembering. Whereas, if you have that conversation every time you meet the warlord Bob, the players eventually will realize it's more effort to not remember the name than to just remember it. So they'll actually be encouraged to remember it more, and that's why you'll get more immersion. Because they'll be like, instead of taking the time to try to remember every time we talk to this guy what we did with them, now you're just like, you're speeding past that part. It's like, oh yeah, Bob, yeah, and then you can remember the more, complicated names like Rythan and Xanthopus. I don't know, whatever you want you want to call them.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.